War and Revolution section. The Savage, the Work Tool, and the Bacillus. A pity that this ingenious reconstruction does not withstand textual analysis. Late Nietzsche's relentless polemic against socialists must not lead us to forget the motif of the destruction of the decadent races. The philosopher expressed the hope that the barbarism of the methods used by the conquistadors in the Congo and wherever, and an awareness of the need to maintain mastery of barbarians, would end up putting paid to the habitual, hateful European sentimentality. This takes us back to revisionism's other colossal repression. While the first ignores total war, the second abolishes the history of colonialism. According to Nolte, in developing his program and methods of struggle, Hitler constantly had in mind the treatment meted out to prisoners of the Chinese Cheka. Quote, "They place a cage containing a half-starved rat in front of his head. The interrogator threatens to open the door." End quote. This was the kind of horror to which Nazism felt compelled to respond. The revisionist historian's argument is the one with which colonialism has traditionally justified its brutality. Let us read a contemporary American historian. Beginning of long quote. "The Filipinos were fighting the kind of war that is based on terror. The Americans fought back just as cruelly. They developed a water torture that made even the Spanish cringe. If a captured Filipino refused to divulge military information, 4 or 5 gallons of water were forced down his throat until his body became an object frightful to contemplate. Then the water was forced out by kneeling on his stomach. The treatment was repeated until the prisoner talked or died." End quote. Torture is not an invention alien to the West, which Nazism could only have imitated by looking to Asiatic Bolshevik barbarism. But Nolte sticks with his schema. Like the barbarism of the means of struggle generally, so the genocides of the 20th century descend from the October Revolution. With the latter, a qualitatively new thing was entering into world history: the collectivist appraisal of guilt and the acts of annihilation that resulted from it. Once again, both total war, and the practice of decimation, and the history of colonialism disappear from the revisionist historian's view. Yet it was precisely to this history that an anti-Semitic deputy made explicit reference in the Reichstag in the late 19th century, when demanding the mass expulsion of the Jews uninhibited by compassion for particular individuals. In India, he stated, the British, quote, "exterminated this whole sect, the Thuggee, without regard to the question whether any particular member of the sect already had committed a murder or not." End quote. But let us return to the rebellion in the Philippines, basing ourselves on the reconstruction of another American historian. The guerrillas were faced not only with the systematic destruction of crops and livestock, but also by mass imprisonment of the population in concentration camps, where it was scythed down by starvation and disease. A general, Jacob H. Smith, issued explicit orders to transform a village into a howling wilderness, resorting, inter alia, to the killing of all males over the age of 10. This was not an isolated gesture. It was necessary, as the War Secretary himself made clear, to employ, quote, "methods which have proved successful in our Indian campaigns in the West." End quote. Hitler constantly referred to white and European expansion in the far West, as well as to the British conquest of India. Underlying genocide is an act of naturalistic despecification, and this goes back to the first instance of the history of colonialism. Naturalistic despecification can in fact take very different forms. We may start with the observations of a historian of slavery, who summarizes a few centuries of Western history as follows, quote, "Negroes were stolen in Africa to work the lands stolen from Indians in America." End quote. Or, in the words of Hobson, the British left-wing liberal closely read by Lenin. Colonial expansion preceded pari passu, with extermination of inferior races who were incapable of profitable exploitation by the superior white settlers. On the one hand, then, we have work tools, applicable to whom are the categories developed by Aristotle in antiquity to define the institution of slavery, which Southern ideologues in the USA continued until the Civil War to celebrate as the foundation of civilization. There was no question about the utility of blacks. Ownership of slaves was an index of wealth and the development of production. The breeding of blacks became a flourishing economic activity in some southern states. Naturally, a presupposition of the profitability of such investments was that the work tools, or beasts of burden as they were sometimes dubbed, remained such. That was why, as Tocqueville reports, severe penalties, including death, attached to teaching slaves to read and write. Barely touched by civilization, blacks continued to be regarded as barbarians. Although adopting mildly abolitionist positions, on the assumption that the real distinctions which nature has made could not be surmounted or challenged, Jefferson came down in favor of deporting emancipated slaves to Africa, so as to avoid a conflict that would end in, quote, the extermination of the one or the other race. The laws of the Jus Publicum Europaeum were inapplicable in this instance. In the late 19th century, Theodore Roosevelt repeated that, should one of the inferior races attack the superior race, the latter would be bound to respond with a war of extermination. Like crusaders, white soldiers would be called upon to put to death man, woman, and child. These were years when strong-arm groups committed to reasserting white supremacy, despite the defeat of the slaveholding South, were unleashed. In some circles, the temptation arose of, quote, wiping the blacks from the face of the earth, thereby definitively averting, quote, the hideous, ominous national menace that loomed over American civilization. With a view to unloosing the Gordian knot of American politics, dynamite could be used so that blacks were gradually exterminated from the face of the earth, as had occurred or was occurring in the case of the Native Americans. So the fate of the Native Americans was to serve as a warning to the slaves or ex-slaves. According to an ideologue on the eve of the Civil War, quote, they are threatened with violent extermination. The fate of the Indians shows that they will be exterminated if they continue so useless and so troublesome. End quote. But to the extent that normality obtained or could be restored, it would be foolish to abandon useful work tools or cheap forced labor. While it only emerged with states of emergency in the case of blacks, the temptation to destroy the Native Americans was constant. They were of little or no economic value. Quote, the Spaniards discovered that one Negro was worth 4 Indians. End quote. The difference in the fate meted out by whites to the two races clearly emerges from reading Tocqueville. Quote, the Europeans have not been able to change the character of the Indians, and though they have had the power to destroy, they have never been able to subdue and civilize them. End quote. In other words, the Native Americans were more resistant than blacks to being reduced to work tools. In any event, while the Europeans wanted to exploit the blacks' labor power, they sought to grab the Native Americans' land. This is something the liberal author expresses in an ideological, subtly apologetic register, almost as if the blacks and Native Americans were responsible for their fate at white hands. Quote, the servility of the one dooms him to slavery, the pride of the other to death. The fact was that civilization has little to hold over the redskin. Far from desiring to conform his habits to ours, he loves his savage life as the distinguishing mark of his race, and repels every advance to civilization. That was why not only have these wild tribes receded, but they are destroyed." End quote. The radical difference in the fate that befell the two unfortunate races becomes clear. The blacks were deported from Africa, and their presence was highly welcome, because it did not challenge the social and natural hierarchy, an outcome easy enough to achieve, given that nature itself rendered the slaves or work tools instantly recognizable by their skin color. By contrast, the Native Americans had to be removed from those fertile lands, which Providence had in fact reserved for the Europeans. Successive deportations, ever further west towards an increasingly remote horizon, were at once a terrible reality and a metaphor for a journey into the void. Whites merely confined themselves to collaborating more or less directly with God's design, depending on the strength of their moral scruples. In addition to the Native Americans' removal, such collaboration could take other forms. In 1790, Franklin wrote, quote, "If it be the design of Providence to extirpate these savages in order to make room for the cultivators of the earth, it seems not improbable that rum may be the appointed means. It has already annihilated all the tribes that formerly inhabited the sea-coast." End quote. Rum was a kind of euthanasia for a race that was already condemned and already dying. There was no inviolable boundary separating recourse to alcohol from the tailor-made spread of contagious diseases, the devastation of the land, the razing of villages, and the use of firearms against the civilian population. And such a boundary was all the more easily crossed in that the victim's resistance seemed stubborn and irrational. Between the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th, Theodore Roosevelt called for putting down savagery and barbarism. Quote, "I don't go so far as to think that the only good Indians are the dead Indians, but I believe 9 out of every 10 are, and I shouldn't like to inquire too closely into the case of the 10th. End quote. A fate similar was suffered in southern Africa by the junglemen and Hottentots, who, Gumplewicz observed, were regarded and treated by the Christian Boers as beings, Geschöpfe, whom it is permissible to exterminate like wild game." End quote. The fate of the Jews was different. The diaspora and the legislation enacted against them severed them from land ownership at a stroke. Hence they could not be assimilated to those savages, the wealth of whose land had to be exploited, lest it be doomed to sterility. Furthermore, given the culture and professional skills that profoundly integrated them into bourgeois modern society, Jews could certainly not be assimilated to the kind of dross represented by the Native Americans and kindred races, of which the engine of civilization somehow needed to be rid so as to be able to proceed more rapidly. They could not even be compared with blacks. It was difficult to include the people of the book in the category of work tools. For a series of historical reasons, moreover, they had been deeply involved in the liberal arts. By virtue of their culture, by dint of their skin color, Jews did not represent alterity instantly recognizable as such. But the less visible it was, the more insurmountable such alterity proved. Hence, it had to be exhibited, by means of ghettos or marks of recognition, in order to contain and control this alien, perfidious element nestling in the very heart of civilization and threatening to undermine its integrity and health. That is why Luther referred to a plague, a pestilence. Hence the metaphor of the Foetor Judaicus. As an 18th century British pastor, Thomas Woolston, observed, quote, "If their bodies neither do or ever did stink living, it remained the case that the world, according to the proverb and common belief of mankind, may be said to stink with them." The category of Foetor Judaicus was merely an initial formulation, as yet insufficiently scientific, of the charge leveled against Jews of constituting a vehicle of infection, a bacillus which, by its very presence, imperiled the health of the social organism. End section.